I've got an echo. I'd like to welcome everybody here tonight, and of course welcome Professor Simon Heller, who's going to talk to us for about 40 minutes tonight about the improvements in treatment since insulin was invented 100 years ago, and then do a bit of a talk about what's coming up. After 40 minutes, there'll be plenty of opportunity to ask questions, and we have got a note of some questions that have been sent in advance. Because of technical problems, slight technical problems, could you please put yourselves on mute while Professor Heller's
that's not a technical problem, Brenda.
What?
If people unmute, we'll get lots of reverberation. When they want to ask questions afterwards, then they can unmute.
Yes, I was just saying because of technical problems. Yeah, can you put yourselves on mute while Professor Heller's doing his presentation, and then you can take yourself off mute when the questions come about. So once again, I'd like to welcome Professor Simon Heller.
Thank you very much, everybody, for asking me to be in this. This is certainly a departure from our usual meetings, but it's a pleasure. So I am going to talk to this subject, and I will share. So I hope everybody can see the screen. Could somebody tell me that they can see the screen? Yeah, okay, great.
Yes,
so the title of my talk is 100 years after the discovery of insulin, what does the future hold for diabetes research? So 100 years ago, Captain Frederick Banting, who was an orthopedic surgeon, was, in fact, March 1919, so over 100 years ago, was demobilized at the end of the First World War and returned to Ontario. During the same year, as you can see on this slide, individuals who'd been diagnosed with diabetes were dying, and the average duration survival of somebody, a young person diagnosed with type 1 diabetes before the discovery of insulin, was approximately 2 to 4 years. The only thing that was done, which may or may not have prolonged their lives, was to put them on what was called a starvation diet. And a doctor in America, Dr. Frederick Allen, devised this diet. So he literally starved these children to death, and in doing so, prevented the production of ketones. And as I'm sure all of you know, diabetic ketoacidosis, if not treated, is a fatal disease, not treated with fluids, intravenously, and insulin. And of course, there was no insulin. These children had a miserable existence. They were literally dying for food. They were not allowed it, and it was a terrible existence. Anyway, so Dr. Banting came back to Canada and thought he could set up practice, but he had real trouble. He couldn't set up practice, so he moved to London, Ontario, and he set up practice as an orthopedic surgeon. Now, what happened subsequently is told in this book. I meant to bring the book. It's by the late Michael Bliss. He's a professor, who was a professor of history at the University of Toronto, and wrote a book about the discovery of insulin. It is a gripping tale. You can obtain it from Amazon online. In fact, it would have been a really appropriate raffle prize. I don't know what the raffle prize.
We have got it as a raffle prize, just not here now.
But I think it would be very fitting for it to be first prize in the, because it's a great book. And for those who don't win the raffle, it's definitely worth a few pounds because the story is extraordinary. So what happened? Well, Banting had this idea, as others had done in the past, that if you could tie off the one of the pancreatic ducts, because you'll remember that the pancreas doesn't only produce insulin through the islets, the other function of the pancreas is to produce digestive enzymes. And the problem is, if you try to extract the insulin from the islets, then what happened was that the enzymes which cause digestion and break down proteins were released, and so digested it. So he had this idea that if you could tie the pancreatic duct, then this would allow the cells which make insulin, which of course, as many of you will know, are called the islets of Langerhans, to survive, extract the insulin, and off they went. And so they tried to do this. They tried to do it in dogs. And on the left, you can see Frederick Banting and a medical student Charles Best, who was recruited by Banting to work through the summer of 1921. And it's important that Banting, of course, was working many miles from the University of Toronto. But John James MacLeod, who was the professor of physiology, had also been quite interested in diabetes. And although he was a bit skeptical that an orthopedic surgeon could make such a discovery, he decided to allow Banting to work in a laboratory there during the summer and gave him a supply of dogs. And this dog, who is initially reputed to be the first dog to receive insulin and see if it could lower the glucose, was apparently called Marjorie. Actually, subsequently, we think that was probably a faked photo. This isn't Marjorie. I'm sure that would really depress you not to know that it isn't Marjorie, but that is definitely Banting and Best on the top of the University of Toronto Physiology building. They worked through the summer and they had full steps and just really weren't making much progress. Occasionally, they would get enough insulin for the glucose to go down. And what they did was to take the dogs and remove the pancreas. So these dogs were given diabetes and then they tested their insulin extractions. And I think this would not have been a successful story if it hadn't been for this man. And this is James Collip. He was a biochemist from Calgary in the western of Canada. And he was brought in by MacLeod because they weren't making any progress. And because he was a biochemist, he worked out how you could extract insulin. And if it hadn't been for him, they probably would have failed and there would have been no discovery, although I'm sure it would have happened later on. The other interesting thing is they had to work out how to measure how much insulin they've got. And so I don't know if any of you know that, but they couldn't measure insulin because they didn't have any, the assays which measure insulin weren't around. So what he did was to have what we, in the technical terms, called a bioassay. So this is something which causes a change in a person or an experimental animal, which would be consistent. So the unit of insulin, the very first unit of insulin was the amount of insulin that if you injected into a rabbit gave an epileptic fit from hypoglycemia. That was the amount. So that's how a unit came about. Now, of course, these days we measure it in a completely different way, but it's of interest to me and it's described in the book how a unit of insulin was measured. Anyway, to cut a long story short, eventually they managed to extract enough insulin, and I think it was on January the 12th in 1922, so just over 100 years ago now, that the first person was injected with insulin and his glucose fell and he lived. He lived, I think, for another 15 years, died in his 30s. But the second and third children who were in Toronto actually lived for many years. So here we were, a fantastic discovery. And it was so good that in 1923, which is just a year later, 2 of these individuals were awarded the Nobel Prize. Now, think how long it takes for a Nobel Prize to be awarded. But everybody realized this was so dramatic and so important that the Nobel Prize Committee in Sweden gave the prize. Now, who do you think they gave the prize to? You might think that Banting and Best, who everybody knows, were the people, but in fact, they did not receive the Nobel Prize. So on the left here is Frederick Banting. Next to him is James John MacLeod, who was the professor of physiology. And the other 2 are Collip and Charles Best. The prize only went to Banting and only went to MacLeod. The other 2 were not considered worthy. And as a result, Banting and MacLeod fell out. In fact, they learned to hate each other. Banting shared half of his prize, which is many thousands of pounds, with Charles Best, and MacLeod shared his prize with Collip. And it's interesting that if you read it, it shows what science is about. Everybody rivals, not sharing anything, and yet they still discovered insulin. And the other person who's very important is somebody working for Eli Lilly. I can't remember his name, but he listened to a lecture that Banting gave in Boston. He owned it, he was very important in a drug company. He realized that this was going to be life-saving for the people across the world, then somebody had to do this in an industrial scale. And so Eli Lilly was the firm, which you've all heard of, I'm sure. And as a result of that, he worked out how to extract insulin in large quantities from animals, beef in particular. And as a result of that, insulin was produced in huge amounts across the world, made Eli Lilly's fortune. They're a huge drug company today, and insulin is just one of many things that they make. But the story, and as I said, I've only briefly described it, but it's a story well worth reading. So here we were, 1923, the Nobel Prize. Everybody assumed that diabetes was cured. That was it. They'd have this insulin. And Frederick Allen, who you remember I mentioned as the inventor of the diet that kept them alive, wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine, very famous paper, diabetes has been scientifically mastered. There, theoretically, every patient can be expected to live out his natural lifetime. And of course, we now know that isn't true, because within 5 to 10 years, they began to discover that people were developing eye trouble and kidney trouble and foot trouble, and were dying prematurely. In fact, the life expectancy in the 30s and 40s of somebody diagnosed with diabetes was just horrendous. We're talking on average, I think in the 50s, women who became pregnant with diabetes, type 1 diabetes, and who went through that pregnancy had a 50% chance of losing their baby at the end. And indeed, many died during the pregnancy. So it's difficult to imagine today. And it wasn't until 1993, when I was at the meeting in Las Vegas, a very big trial proved that what was needed was glucose control, glucose close to normal, which would prevent complications. It took till 1993. And of course, since then, our whole efforts are, or should be, designed to equip people with type 1 diabetes with the expertise to allow them to keep their glucose close to normal. So I haven't got time to do it anymore, but I just want to contrast where we were 100 years ago, thinking diabetes was cured, where we are today. So let's just have a look at some data. So this is the incidence rate, the number of people developing type 1 diabetes in children aged under 15 years. And essentially, look at the dark blue, the lighter blue, compare that to others. the dark blue is where there's very little type 1 diabetes. You can see that in Africa, it's grey because we don't have sufficient information. We do know that it's much rarer, but you'll see that the majority of type 1 diabetes is in North America, in Europe, and in Australia and New Zealand. And although it doesn't hold completely, the more north you are, the more likely you are to develop diabetes, with one or two exceptions. And what's really interesting, if you look at Saudi Arabia here, it's got a very high rate of diabetes, and we don't know why. But it's really interesting that in a very hot country, type 1 diabetes is really common. Now let's look at comparison of type 1 diabetes and prevalent cases and deaths. And these data, taken from the International Diabetes Federation World Atlas, have divided this up according to low-income countries, lower and middle-income countries, upper middle-income countries, and high-income countries. So what you see here are the rates. I think the first is incidence, the number of people developing diabetes over a given time. In the middle is the prevalence of diabetes. And underneath, you can see the number of deaths. And it is quite striking and a lesson to us all that most of the diabetes occurs in high income and upper middle income countries and lower middle income countries. But if you look at the mortality is just extraordinarily high in lower middle income and those countries. So, of course, we've transformed diabetes in this country and others, but I just want to draw your attention to lower and middle income countries where the prevalence of diabetes is quite high, and yet the mortality is frighteningly high as well. So it may be better here, but we've got a huge job to do. And if we look at type 2 diabetes, which I haven't mentioned, because when insulin was discovered, nobody knew about type 2 diabetes, and it became much more obvious in the 50s and 40s, particularly after the war, that there was different type of diabetes, that people still made insulin, but it didn't work very well, and it was associated with being overweight. And if we add them to the numbers, it is really frightening. We're talking millions and millions of people with diabetes. And you can see, if we go through these different countries, overall, there's going to be a 46% increase between 2021 and 2045 across the world, and particularly in those countries below in red and purple, with the Middle East, I think it is, having an 87% rise in diabetes, and sub-Saharan Africa expecting 136% increase over the next 24 years. So diabetes is not going away. In fact, it's increasing. So this talk is about research, but I'm setting the scene to say, how on earth are we going to improve, treat, prevent, and cure diabetes? And I've just chosen a few areas where I think there's real interest and promise, and I've chosen type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. In type 1 diabetes, I'm going to talk a bit about what I call fooling the immune system, what we technically call immunotherapy, and that's now a realistic treatment, as you'll see. I'm going to talk about the artificial pancreas, or closed loop device, as again, the technical term. I'm going to talk about stem cells, which are now being given to people with diabetes. And I'm not talking about transplants. I'm talking about manufactured stem cells, which can be made in huge numbers, billions of cells, and now offer us the prospect that we might cure type 1 diabetes. And not just children, people who've had diabetes for a long time, if only we can use those cells. But as you'll see, there's real problems which are going to prevent that. In terms of type 2 diabetes, I want to talk about how we might induce remission. And you've all heard of cancer remission. In other words, the cancer goes away. Well, we now have evidence that in type 2 diabetes, that can be done, not with fancy, expensive drugs, but with other interventions which are described. The diabetes prevention program, which is now happening in this country, and talk a bit about extending new technologies to type 2 diabetes, because of course, technology is transforming the care in rich countries. I want to emphasize that. It's going to be a hell of a long time before the artificial pancreas gets to lower and middle income countries. In fact, possibly another 100 years, the way things are going. So let's just talk about this. So the first thing is immunotherapy, fooling the immune system to prevent or delay type 1 diabetes. Is it worth it? And indeed, I think Ian Patterson, who's a good friend and colleague, has asked a question of whether it's worth it. And I'm telling you, it is worth it. In fact, it's worth it now. And I'll explain why. Because if we can keep the cells which make insulin in type 1 diabetes working, and when you get type 1 diabetes, you have about 10% of your cells which make insulin, your beta still working. If we can keep them working, then type 1 diabetes is so much easier to manage your cells. It reduces the risk of hypoglycemia. It allows you to get glucose much closer to target, possibly without lots of different injections, which of course we use, or pumps. Hypoglycemia is a lot less of a side effect. In fact, severe hypoglycemia is very rare in people who still make their own insulin. It reduces long-term complications. It prevents ketoacidosis, of course, which still kills both adults and children in this country every year because primary care physicians and their teams miss type 1 diabetes, particularly in very young babies. And also, interestingly, in older people, because it's assumed they must have type 2 diabetes. And indeed, I was at a talk that Theresa May gave, ex-Prime Minister, and it took her, I think she said 3 years before somebody realized she didn't have type 2 diabetes and in fact had type 1. And she felt terrible during that time. So it can affect anybody. And I think the other thing, it's the first step to ensure permanent beta cell preservation and essentially a cure for type 1 diabetes. So let's just talk a bit about that. So we've learned a lot about diabetes type 1, and you can see that it's now given stages, just like cancer, actually, but in a very different context. So in stage 1, you can see that the beta cells are 100%. They're still working, but what we now know is that antibodies, which are being produced, which is, you know, it's part of the immune system, are signifying that the beta cells are about to be destroyed. And we also know that that can go on for years. Obviously, if you get diabetes at 2 years as a baby, it's only taken 2 years, but the older you are, the longer that can take. And then you'll see that as the cells, the beta cells in the islets begin to be destroyed, stage 2 occurs, and we begin to see the number of cells going down. These people are what is called technically pre-symptomatic. In other words, they have no symptoms, they're not feeling ill. If we were to measure their glucose, we would find that it was probably a bit elevated. But of course, we rarely do that. In fact, the one time that we often spot it, and it can even certainly can fool hospital doctors, is if a woman becomes pregnant, because you'll be aware perhaps that when you're pregnant, you're much more resistant to insulin, you need much more insulin. So of course, if you don't have diabetes, that's not a big deal, you just make more. But if you're asking a a pancreas which is beginning to fail to make more insulin, then your glucose goes up. And we screen all women these days for gestational diabetes. And we used to tend to forget that if they were normal weight, they didn't have the characteristics of somebody with type 2, then they might well have type 1. And in fact, I had a patient many years ago who is now my patient because I see her in the clinic, but she got gestational diabetes, and a year later, she felt a bit thirsty. She measured her glucose, it was up. She still had insulin in the fridge. So she just started giving insulin herself because that's what she did when she was pregnant. Didn't come and see a doctor at all until she ran out of her supply. And that's when she was referred. But she just did that off her own back. What would have been much more dangerous is if she hadn't worked it out, she might well have become very ill. And so then finally, we've got symptomatic type 1 diabetes. That's when you get diabetes. It happens very suddenly, as you will know, particularly in children who can become very ill. But you'll notice that there's 10% of beta cells there. It's not 0, it's 10%. You might say to me, well, why do you get diabetes so suddenly when you've got 10% left? Is it that's just not enough? And the fact is, 10% is enough to keep you going. But what happens is that as the glucose goes up, it poisons the beta cells. They can't release their own insulin. And so you get a vicious downward spiral, and their cells stop making. And so somebody becomes very ill. Essentially, they're not making insulin. But if you then treat them again with insulin, often those cells kick in again. And I'm sure you've all heard what we call the honeymoon period. It's because the cells have started working again. And in some cases, that can go on for 3 or 4 years. In fact, I saw a patient just yesterday, and Elaine, and I saw her in the clinic, and we were talking about that, because when she first got diabetes for 4 years, she was on insulin at all. She thought she was cured. And then, of course, it came back. And to be frank, she struggled a bit with her diabetes since then, but she said it was like a miracle. She didn't have it anymore just for a few years. And that's highly relevant to what I'm going to talk about. So this is a drug called teplizumab. It's an antibody, and if you ever see a drug which ends with a mab, it's antibody, AB. Now, these drugs have transformed care in a whole range of conditions which we call autoimmune. In other words, the body is acting against itself. And in rheumatoid arthritis, which of course used to be a crippling disease, a friend of mine is a rheumatologist, looks after people, and he says it's quite extraordinary. In rheumatology now, they just don't see it. And ankylosing spondylitis and other rheumatology conditions, they give these antibodies, not teplizumab, other ones, and they just stop the disease dead in its tracks. And we have been trying, or scientists have been trying, to use antibodies in type 1 diabetes for many years without success. What happens is that now we can measure, as I've said, the antibodies in people years before they get diabetes. We can predict with 100% certainty that they will get diabetes almost certainly as the years go by, although sometimes, very interestingly, the process stops for reasons we don't understand. But the vast majority will get diabetes. And so you look at relatives at risk for type 1 diabetes, because they're the ones who are tested. That type 1 diabetes often, not always, runs in families. And so this was published in 2019, just before the COVID pandemic. It was a study in the US, published again in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it was a breakthrough. And the reason I say that it was a breakthrough is on this slide. And so what you can see here is a graph showing the number of people who are free of type 1 diabetes. And they're divided into two. This is a randomized trial, and half were given placebo and half were given this drug, teplizumab. And let's look at what happens, because you can see that at the end of 72 months, there's a big difference between the two. And if you were lucky enough to be given teplizumab, shown in red, we're now down to what? Around 45% at the end of 72 months without diabetes compared to placebo, in other words, no treatment, and that's 22%. So what you can see here, that you have a 50% chance of not having diabetes at, what, 72 months. So this is remarkable. This is a disease-free time which will make a difference, as I've tried to explain. And my view is, and I'm not an expert in this, but this is going to get better and better and better. 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And then we've not made a cure yet, but I would predict in the next 20 years, we'll be able to delay for 10 years. And that will dramatically change the prognosis. So what's said here is the first step to prevention. And of course, what we will be doing at the moment, we start at stage 2. In other words, the time when people are beginning to lose their beta cells. But if these treatments are shown to be safe, particularly in children, where it's a bit dodgy, fiddling around with the immune system, and start very early, then, as you can see, we may be preventing diabetes for a large number of years. And so this is extremely exciting. It's why immunotherapy is going to cure type 1 diabetes, I would predict. Unfortunately, not in my clinic or probably in my lifetime, but it's a real prospect now. But it now presents us with a problem. And in the first question that I've been asked is exactly this. When will an effective combination of immune therapy justify screening not just the children who are related to somebody with type 1 diabetes, but all children? I'm sure many of you know that we do a test at birth in all babies to look for an underactive thyroid gland. Just with a little heel prick and a drop of blood, we will be able to do the same thing. In fact, we can do it now. We could be screening the whole population. And at the moment, there's a big discussion in those discussions, because I'm privileged to be one of the chairs of panels which judge research that comes to the National Institute of Health Research, the research arm of the NHS. And we're thinking, when will it be worthwhile, pretty expensive, testing all the children who are born? And it's something we might want to discuss. So that's all I want to say about prevention. But here we are, 100 years after insulin's discovered, and now we've got real prospective cure. Sadly, not for those of you who have type 1 diabetes. I'm afraid you missed the boat, as they would say. But for your children or possibly grandchildren who might get type 1 diabetes, it is something which will make a big difference. I want to talk a bit about stem cell therapy now, and I'll have to speed up because I'd like to give some time for discussions, both from you, the 6 of you in the audience, and those more people at home. And this, I think, is again incredible. I would never have believed this could be done, but we now have stem cell therapy, cellular therapy, which could cure all of you with type 1 diabetes straight away. Sadly, not type 2. It's probably not a good idea to give loads of insulin to people with type 2 diabetes, and we could discuss that. But for type 1, the kind of diabetes that was there 100 years ago, we could do that, and we can do that even for people who've had diabetes for a long time. Now, what has been done with loads of experiments on mice, I don't know if any of you are anti-animal experimenters, and say this should never be done. But without this, we would never have got to this stage. So there's a moral dilemma for those who are animal lovers. But what they've been able to do is to take particularly fecal cells, but now the real prospect, you could take just stomach cells. And they've worked out how these cells, which start off as, a little bit, the tiny egg, the fertilized egg, the blastocyst, as it's called technically, and that those few cells turn into a human being, and of course, animals as well. And they've worked out what are the chemicals, the hormones, the growth factors that need to be given to cells to turn them into the islets of Langerhans. And so here you see a normal islet with the B cells, the alpha cells, which make glucagon, and the delta cells, which make other hormones, somatostatin, and the blood supply. And here you see an artificial islet. And you can see it looks pretty simple, common, it almost looks the same, and it is almost the same. So over the last few years, certain companies have made these, and they are in a position to make loads. And you might say, well, Harry, I like to stand, why don't you cure my type 1 diabetes right now? But there's a problem. Although in October last year, a company called Vertex, working with brilliant scientists at Harvard in the US, have developed their islets, and they gave them to a person. In fact, they've now tested, I think, 6 people. And I am privileged because I was asked, not quite by Vertex, to join a group of doctors and researchers who are on their advisory board, advising them about how they might design their trials in the future. I think I have no idea where I was asked, probably because I'm interested in hypoglycemia. Anyway, we were shown the results, and I'm not allowed to tell you all the results. All I'm prepared to say is that on this patient, he was, most of his insulin, not all of it, he was still using a tiny bit of insulin, but most of it was being produced by these cells after day 90. Now, that is not a cure, but it is dramatic. Now, we can cure type 1 diabetes, but by giving pancreas transplant, but you'll also know that we can give islet cells from cadavers, dead people who've been killed in accidents. And usually need 2 or 3 people. You need to put all the cells together, and then give them some to be. And the only people who are having that treatment are the people at the moment, people who have very severe hypoglycemia, no warnings, and they're being used. But the problem, and the reason we can't do this in children, is we still have to give what we call immunosuppressives. In other words, drugs which prevent rejection, and we can't do that. So this is not a cure. It could be done in adults who probably can take immunosuppressives for 10, 20 years. The trouble with immunosuppressive, the drugs which prevent rejection and which prevent onset of type 1 diabetes, are that they cause side effects. And the most important side effects after many years is to increase the risk of blood cancers, such as a condition we call lymphoma. So at the moment, considering the majority of people get diabetes in their between 5 and 15, we cannot give this treatment to children. So what can we do? Well, we can do things about it. It is possible to cover the surface of the islet with a coating of material, which means the immune system couldn't get in. They wouldn't recognize them as foreign. And lots of work is being done to try and cover the surface of all these islets. It's called encapsulation, and it's very far to go, but the first steps are being taken. The other thing we might do is to fool the immune system, give drugs which could make the immune system not recognize them. Again, work has started on that, but we can't do it. But it looks as if we will be able to give islet cells to more and more people. At the moment, I think it's going to take a lot more work, how the best the islet should be given, how many should be given. We don't know any of the answers to that, and it's going to mean more and more research. But this is, again, the first step to curing people who already have type 1 diabetes. So very exciting. And finally, a bit about hybrid closed loop. This is available at Sheffield. If you want to be on a hybrid closed loop, you can't. But we've recently participated in, it wasn't a proper research trial, but this is very clever treatment using a continuous glucose monitor, which you've all heard of. Some of you, I suspect, are using one, attached to an insulin pump, and a very clever computer, which can work out what the glucose is and adjust the insulin. The problem, and there is also a problem in this, is that the quick insulin that you take, Nova Rapid, I've made a crack, I hope there's nobody from Novo Nordisk, it should not be called Novo Rapid, it should be called Novo Too Slow, but it probably wouldn't catch on because it doesn't work fast enough. And one of the commonest questions I ask people is how long for insulin to get going. And people say 10 minutes. A lot of nurses say 15 minutes. And when they teach patients to leave a gap, well, I can tell you it's 30 to 45 minutes before insulin begins to lower the glucose. So if you're injecting, and I don't know how many of you are with type 1 diabetes injecting, you have to leave a gap of 30 minutes to 45 minutes. In pregnancy, where we're completely obsessed with encouraging women to maintain near normal glucose, we say 45 minutes. Now, this is a typical doctor thing. 45 minutes is a very long time to wait and very impractical. But those of you who have CGM should do the test yourself because you have the information now. And when you see a vertical rise, which I see very frequently when I work with people with diabetes, I say, why do you think that's happened? Oh, I don't know. I've overtreated my hypo, but you were having a regular meal. It's because you haven't covered the food with insulin, which of course is what somebody like me who doesn't have diabetes does automatically. The insulin comes in as we start to eat our food. And so as the food is digested, which happens very quickly, again, something you'll see when you do your CGM, the insulin levels have to be high. And what you'll see is instead of a big alpine peak, you'll see a gentle Sheffield hill. And that shows that you're giving the right amount of insulin. Is it difficult? It's blooming difficult. But you have to do that if you want to, if you like, follow the precepts of the DAFNE principles. And we're very bad at telling people. Want to ask a question, Lindsay?
Well,
yes.
So this morning, my blood was, I think it was like 8 when I woke up.
Right.
Had my insulin, it went to 7.8, then it went up again to 8, and
Yeah.
then like an hour and a half later, I thought I'm actually going to eat something, but on another day, like say my blood was 5,
Yeah.
and I had the insulin. The insulin probably work in 10 minutes.
Well,
and I'd be hypo.
Well, I'd be very surprised if that insulin is not working in 10 minutes. I guarantee it. What it means is the insulin you've got on board is working. And that's the problem that you have. And not only that, let's build in something called the dawn effect. We all make hormones as we wake up. And you might be doing activity, you might be anxious. That's why type 1 diabetes is the most difficult condition to manage, but tough. You got it, you got sorted out, it's hard, it's impossible, but you can only do the best you can. And importantly, you don't have to get it perfectly right, every glucose, to do a fantastic job. The other problem is meals have to be, you can't do this automatically. You have to let the computer know you're about to eat, which is why we don't call it closed loop, we call it hybrid closed loop. And for those of you who do physical activity, particularly, riding a bike, you've got to build that into this. So a hybrid closed loop is not perfect. It is very good, and it has made a difference. And I think I would be using one of these if I had diabetes, but it's not perfect. And the other thing is, and a lot of people don't know this, if you know your DAFNE principles, if you know how to manage you can really make the most of this. If you don't, I think it'll do everything automatically. It's a blooming disaster, and it doesn't work nearly as well as you want. Okay, so will hybrid closed loop systems enable effective and cost-effective treatment for those who struggle to engage? I see a lot of people with diabetes, and I have done, and there are significant proportion, 10, 20, maybe a quarter, who hate diabetes so much, they just can't be doing all this. They just can't do it. They're not bad people, but for psychological reasons and for lots of other reasons, domestic pressures, will this work? I think it'll work a bit, but not nearly as well as you want. Right, quickly on to type 2 diabetes. This is called inducing remission. This is a direct study. It involved a good number of people, actually. And what they did, they had to agree to participate in this. So these were people who really wanted to get rid of their diabetes. You can see that they were average age 20 to 65, a big range of BMI, but all overweight. Type 2 diabetes, around 6 years on average. And they had to be not on insulin. And they had to agree before they started to take 800 calories a day for 3 months. Now you might say, well, that's not too bad, but it's a pretty big deal. Some of them took it as a liquid diet. Other people just took less to eat and they stuck to it. And we can see at the end of it, there was a significant proportion whose weight had changed by 16 kilos. 32 pounds is a lot of weight to lose, but it didn't happen in everybody. And if they did, they had a 32% chance of their diabetes disappearing. So that was pretty good. It disappeared completely. They stopped all their tablets, blood pressure and blood glucose lowering agents, and did pretty well. If you lost less weight, you didn't do quite so well. 10% were in remission. Of course, their glucose levels improved and get down. And you can see for those who didn't lose, 6 kilos, none of them were in remission at all. So they had to lose a hell of a lot of weight for this to work. But quite a few of them did okay. You'll notice at the end of 2 years, they were drifting back up, because who can keep this kind of thing going? They obviously didn't have to stay on a very low diet for more than 3 months. But nevertheless, it shows what can be achieved with drastic weight loss. For those of you who think you can go to the gym, tough. It's all about losing weight. Physical activity obviously helps, but I can't remember. Everybody I say, oh, I'm so overweight, doc, I can't do physical activity. Doesn't matter. It's not about physical activity. Physical activity is very important because it keeps your heart healthy and you live longer because you don't have many heart attacks and strokes. But if you want to get rid of diabetes, lose weight. And my diet, I'm a bit rude about dietitians, although they're very important. My diet, I usually say to medical students, what's a diet for diabetes? And they scratch their heads and say, how many carbs, how many protein? I don't know. My 2 words, eat less. And that's what a diet should be. And I know there are some people, in fact, there's a thing here about low carb diets. If that works for you, fine, but it doesn't work for many. It's eat less calories, I'm afraid. Okay, research question here. Is this realistic for most people? I'm a bit of a skeptic, and the answer is I don't think so, but I might be wrong. And at the moment, this is being tried out across the country. Very important for those that can do. What do I think? Well, that was a trial of people who wanted to be in it. And I've talked to quite a few people. I don't see that many people with type 2 because they see GPs. And I think this is probably going to work for about 15–20% of people, of whom not everybody will get remission. But, 1 in 10 people to lose their diabetes completely, for at least for a bit, will be good. So I just want to talk briefly about diabetes prevention program. And it just tells you that it's quite successful. And we now have 300,000 people across the country who've been referred for education, behavior change, helping people to change the habits of a lifetime. Now, I've said, and I mean it, that I think type 1 diabetes is probably the most difficult condition of the whole world, of conditions for the person in terms of what they have to do. Type 2 diabetes is probably the second most difficult, because changing the habits of a lifetime, particularly when you're listening to eating more, it's very social, and saying, oh, you've got to lose weight. Again, typical doctor, I just said it, you have to lose weight. But expecting people to change, it's often part of their ethnic background. And we are so naive into thinking we can just tell people and wave them goodbye. And what's even worse, we then tell them off when they can't manage it. But I'm afraid that's the way that medicine, well, it still is, although I think it's improved. Nevertheless, this is quite impressive, but you'll see the weight loss is 3.3. Don't forget, of course, they don't have diabetes and it may be preventing it. So it's obviously not the same as the direct trial. And we got the A1C where it went down a little bit, 2.4 millimoles per mole. That's quite a lot, actually. We don't know how long for, but you'll also see that females, people from Black ethnicity and lower socioeconomic status, guess what? They found it much more difficult, one, to attend and had less improvement. So the research question here is, how can we modify this to increase attendance, retention, go to all the classes and achieve better outcomes? It's going to work brilliantly in Southwest Sheffield, but come to the Northeast Sheffield, which is where I work, and my clinical base is, it's going to be much tougher. I don't even really understand what the Pakistani population feel about this, because I can't communicate with them. And that's something that we have to address as physicians. Okay, just finally, I just want to talk a little bit about this trial. We published, we presented it, and all it shows is that if you give Libra devices to people after they've had a heart attack or what we call acute coronary syndrome, it's a very severe unstable angina, we can reduce hypoglycemia. That's all it shows. And it's important because we know that keeping glucose normal after a heart attack can reduce mortality. But hypoglycemia can prevent it. We showed it actually worked better for people on sulfonylureas, which was interesting. We still don't understand why. And the reason that we've done that is that research which we've done has shown that hypoglycemia can actually increase your risk of heart attacks and strokes. So the side effect of insulin can be very damaging to people with type 2 diabetes, and it also causes irregular heart rates. So we don't know, of course, whether this will make a difference, but it's going to be quite hard to persuade governments like ours, who don't want to spend much money on the health service anyway, to offer CGM to people. But I think there's a research question here. Will CGM prove effective and cost effective in individuals with type 2 diabetes? One, by reducing hypoglycemia. Of course, if you're not on insulin or sulfonylureas, that doesn't matter. But very important, if we want to change people's behavior, shouldn't we be motivating them? And I think that's a real question that needs to be answered by research. So just very quickly, this is an example of wrong. This is comparing disease prevalence with where research takes place. And this is in type 1 diabetes. So you can see where the work into research versus disease prevalence. And we're not researching in the same places. Look at all the dark red. That's where all the diabetes is. And that's where all the studies are taking place. So that's brilliant, isn't it? This is type 2 and exactly the same thing. That research activity is very prevalent in certain parts of the country, but not where the disease is. because the researchers aren't necessarily living in those areas. I'm pleased to say in Sheffield, I'm working in an area of high prevalence. I'm not pleased, but it's good that we're doing research here. And the mismatch is a great example is in Leeds. That's where the research takes place. Look at Bradford. That's where the disease is. And look at the contrast between the two. And NHR, who I'm pleased to say I work with and for, are trying to persuade people we should change it. So conclusions. Sadly, 100 years after the discovery of insulin, diabetes is far from cured, but it's a hell of a lot better than it was. Diabetes will continue to be a major health problem. I did write probably for another 100 years, but I changed that this afternoon, but hopefully not for another 100 years. That's assuming the world still exists and hasn't burnt to a frazzle. Diabetes place unique demands on individuals in both self-management and behavior change. Research and innovation, I hope I've demonstrated, does offer fantastic promise of better treatment, prevention and cure, even cure, and it has already made differences. And I'm just doing a plug for the North of England, and I speak as a Londoner and a Tottenham Hotspur fan. The North of England offers considerable potential in offering opportunities to participate in clinical studies. And with that, I'm going to finish and stop sharing. There's still a few people on the phone, and I'm happy to answer. Yeah. I'm happy to answer questions, and if people have got questions, and I just need to see who they are. And Brenda, you are meant to chair, but whether we can see people who want to ask questions. Okay, so I've answered. Okay, so Ian Patterson, a colleague, what did he ask? Oh, he asked about C-peptide activity. And for those who don't know, C-peptide is a way of measuring how much insulin you make. When insulin in the body, it releases a little bit of protein, and we call that C-peptide, and we can measure it. And it's a way of measuring how much insulin people still make. And he points out, is it quite unusual? Yes, it is. Why do some people keep that? We don't know. He suggested glucose is close to normal or exercise right at the start of diagnosis. Sadly, doesn't look like glucose levels close to normal make any difference, I'm afraid, Ian. And if you had type 1, which method would you use to manage it? I would use immunosuppression. That's what I would do, and because I think it works. How do people offer themselves up for trials? They find out what research is going on at their local centre and they write. We are in the immunotherapy consortium, and we have people coming from across the north to have these drugs given to them, and we keep them on the clinical research facility overnight in Sheffield, and they come from miles sometimes, and they're fantastic. Yes?
Yeah, before into that, are you still running that database that anybody that wants to be in diabetes trials can register? I'm not sure whether it's diabetes trials only or all trials can register on your database, and you
Yes, if people are willing to sign up.
Is it once a one-off, or do you have to renew it every so often?
We have to renew it every so often, because if people contact the Diabetes Centre, we've got a great research team who I work with, and we would make a list of trials. Is there any low carb support for people in Sheffield? For those who believe that it is useful, our dietitians would definitely go through it. It isn't without risk, but as long as they know that ketones can be a side effect, indeed ketones which make you anorexic may be something people are seeking. But I think It can be done, and for those that like it, I think no reason, and our dietitians could definitely support that. Whether community dietitians could as well, I think they probably could. So it doesn't probably matter if you're treated in primary care. Why are diabetes and other medical conditions are on the increase? Well, when it comes to type 2, I'm afraid it's lifestyle, and that's it really. In type 1 diabetes, we don't really understand why, but there's some evidence actually the rise in type 1 diabetes may be going off. And then the last question here is, I was in an SGLT trial for people with type 1 diabetes, and when it had a great effect on my blood sugar and no side effects. How many people, oh yeah, and why is it not used? It's not used because if you don't know what you're doing, you can go into ketoacidosis, and at least one trial, somebody's died. So at least in the UK, the drug companies who make these medications have decided it's too hazardous, they're going to be sued. So at the moment, we can't use them. I would say, and this is also something which is worth mentioning, is that there's some evidence that SGLT2 inhibitors, drugs which make you pee out more glucose, can not only lower your glucose and help to lower your weight, they may protect your kidneys from getting the worst complication, which is diabetic kidney disease. Now, if we prove that, and there are trials going on, we're going to have to find a way of safely giving to people with type 1 diabetes. And of course, the irony is the people who really need them are the people who don't take their insulin regularly, because they're the ones most likely to get complications, and they're the ones who are most at risk of getting a ketoacidosis. So it'll be a really important question. The other thing I would say is that the other drugs which we've learned used in type 2 are about to be used in large amounts in type 1, and that is what we call GLP-1 analogs. Some of you may have heard of them. Semaglutide is a good example. Liraglutide is another one, and they're better ones. They are fantastic at helping people to lose weight, and struggling with your weight is a side effect of type 1, partly because insulin is given in the wrong place. On the other hand, these medications are expensive, and they, at the moment, although they're fantastic, they need to be given forever, and it's going to cost the NHS a lot of money.
Well, that was the first one you mentioned. SGLT, was it?
SGLT2 inhibitors, dapagliflozin, any flozins.
It helps when if you
No, flozin or Utide is a GLP-1. I know, why do we make it so complicated for people? Probably because we want to show how clever we are, so nobody else knows what we're talking about. The lawyers do the same thing. I'm sorry, I should have apologize on behalf. How many type 1s in Sheffield have got tech? I asked Jackie this, and she gave a very unhelpful answer, bless her. She said, it's about average for us compared to everybody else. And then I said, well, what hell's average in this country? And I never got a reply. But I know for pumps, it's about 15%. And the problem with CGM is it's going up and up and up. I think it's probably 50, 60% now in Sheffield, which is great. But it's amazing. Quite a few people say, I don't want to be on that machine. I want to prick my finger. I think you must be off your head. But anyway, it's it. So those are my questions. Any more questions? Yeah, Brenda, you got more.
Yeah.
You're meant to be the chair. You're not meant to ask questions.
You're doing such a good job of managing
Can
questions.
everyone hear people who are in the room with Simon?
Ian, can you hear Lindsay saying anything then? Yes?
Yeah.
If you can all shout. And for those who would like to talk, if you can put your hand up, I will mute our line and you can ask your question. But Lindsay, oh, Brenda first.
There's something I didn't realise from your beginning of your talk. When you said that the amount of insulin that they had to give a rabbit to give it a hypo, which is an epileptic fit, Is an epileptic fit a side effect of a very low level hypo?
It is. It is.
Never realised that.
Well, if you are a parent of a child, and I'll tell you an anecdote which tells what a rotten thing diabetes is. I started to look after a 16-year-old when they came up from the children's hospital. And this mother who told me that when her son was 10, she went into his bedroom and he was having a seizure, an epileptic fit. She was convinced he was going to die, but he didn't. A paramedic survived him. But at that point, she moved out of her marital bed and moved into a single bed in her son's bedroom and stayed in there for 4-5 years. And when we gave him a CGM, of course, she moved back again. Now, I don't know what you think of quality of life, but that ain't the quality of life.
The reason I asked that is, I've been in a survey thing, it's one of yours actually, and one of the things it said is something about
Sure, people can't hear you.
what happens when you go very low. Well, by definition, I don't know. Are the people your side effects if you have a hypo? Well, I don't know because I don't know what other people can see.
Yeah, that's
and unless somebody actually tells you, oh, we saw you, we thought you were drunk, or we thought you would fall over something, you don't know because you can't see. And I think quite often friends are too polite to say something, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that that's true. I think, but just to let you know, this is another thing that happened in the 50s. Hypoglycemia was once used as a treatment for schizophrenia. So people without diabetes were given seizures deliberately in the 50s to try and treat their schizophrenia. That's before they cut bits of their brain out. And it didn't work very well. And as I read a review and it said, surprisingly, not a lot of people died, is what the description was. But yeah, it was used to be called insulin shock therapy. I don't know who was more shocked. Probably anyway.
I've heard of that, but I've forgotten.
Yeah. Okay, Lindsay, any questions? Oh, and then okay, Liz, I'm just muting, and if you I'm just about to mute. If you unmute and shout at us, we'll see if we can hear you.
Is that me, Liz? Yes. First of all, a quick comment. You said that you would go on the immunosuppressants and take that route if you had diabetes. I did know a lady who had diabetes for about 60 years. She died recently, and she'd had a transplant because of severe hypos, very severe hypos. And she said she wished she'd never done it because it was hell living on the immunosuppressants. So that's just a comment. I don't know. That's just what she said. The question I have is about screening, talking about screening everybody or screening just the parents of the children of parents who've got type 1. And this is, I'm asking this really for a friend because I had a very long discussion about this at the weekend with another type 1 or a group of type 1s. And the view was that people shouldn't be screened because, especially children, because it would mean regular blood tests, regular visits to hospital, and the kids would be hospitalized long before they ever got type 1 diabetes. And my argument against that is that that's up to the parents. If the parents make it a big deal and make it a big drama, then the child may get traumatized by it or, burdened by it. But I'm just curious to know what the general view is about that, about the intensity of the surveillance that's needed for if everybody was going to be tested who was suspected to get type 1.
Okay, thank you. So let me answer that it's a very personal opinion. And the reason that I think it's interesting is because I'm on the program grant panel and I chair one. I was talking to Colin Diane and Rachel Besser, both researchers in this area, because they were grant to our program, and we offer a lot of money, 2 to 3, even £4 million to do the studies. And they made the case that we should do it to prevent the deaths of very little children who get ketoacidosis and die. My own view was that that wasn't a good explanation. And of course, I don't know what they put into their preliminary grant because I work with them, I'm not allowed to judge their research. But I don't think actually, I mean, there are a few children who do die of DKA, and it's terrible, particularly very young babies. And the fact that very young babies die, I think is also going to be a problem, because I just said it's like a Guthrie test. It's like a test when you first get born, and we'll measure them in newborn babies. But of course, it's very likely that we won't see those antibodies right at the start. So you're right, we will need to repeat the test. But to be honest, if it's a finger prick test once a year, or something like that, would that be so terrible? I don't think it would hospitalize or medicalize those. It could be done in GP surgery. After all, these kids are having vaccinations, and my 4-year-old granddaughter has had COVID, I think 3 times, and she's had the thing stuck up her nose and she takes it in her stride. So I think it depends. I think it's a very difficult decision. It can't be done on the children of parents with diabetes, because most diabetes is sporadic. In other words, it's not genetic. And so it would miss lots of people. The problem is that if you talk to parents and their children haven't got diabetes, they haven't got a clue what type 1 diabetes is. They don't know what it is, and they may well object. And on the other hand, I know that parents who've brought up one child are just terrified that another child in their family is going to get it, and have sort of said, would I measure antibodies? Of course, I would send them to the children's hospital. When I was asked that question 5 years ago, I used to say, well, there's not much you can do about it, and we will recognize diabetes as soon as it happens. And I was reluctant, but if they insisted, I would measure them, because I think it's somebody's right to know. But until we have treatment, I just think tocilizumab, and Ian, who's also is listening, he asked me that question early on, and I think absolutely, this is a game changer. This is the most fantastic thing in the world, and I just can't overemphasize what a difference it could make. I see people who still make insulin with type 1 diabetes. I don't know why. After 20 years, they have no hypoglycemia, severe hypoglycemia. I mean, nobody thinks type 1 is easy, but they thought, I don't know what the fuss is about. I take my insulin and it works pretty well and I'm fine. If we could turn type 1 diabetes into that, and particularly help teenagers through what must be such a difficult condition, then I think we'd be winning. And so I'm all for that. And I'm just delighted that Sheffield is a partner in these studies, which are very exciting, actually. So that's a personal view, Liz, and I'm not sure everybody would agree with me, but who knows, maybe they would.
Yeah, well, I think it's quite a critical question. It'd be really interesting to know what Joe Public on the whole thinks about it. You know, if they were to say, let's screen everybody. But can I just say what my personal view is? I think that people are far more concerned about, well, I would say this, but I think people these days, the parents of youngsters are just absolutely neurotic and think they're going to instantly die, and it's so damaging to the child, so damaging. And I think if the system were able to support carers and parents better, so that they didn't transmit all that anxiety, it would transform the lives of young people.
So I absolutely agree with you if there's somebody in the family, but if you ask Joe Public what they think of type 1 diabetes, well, for a start, they think it's because they're overweight, and the children who are at school, I mean, we are storing up such a problem. All the kids tease them, you know what kids are like. oh, you're eating the wrong things, you can't have sweets. When I was training in diabetes in 82, we took the kids to Scarborough for the day and from a diabetic kids camp. And the first thing was we used to sit these kids down and make them eat their 30 grams that their parents had told us they had. Some of these kids would take an hour and a half to eat blooming 30 grams. And we were stupid enough to make them do it. I mean, how so-called intelligent people can think that this is a good way of looking after diabetes? Can you think of the trauma that we were storing up for them when they became adolescents? And then we took them all off to Scarborough and said, you can have an ice cream. And they all looked at each other. I'm sorry, mister, but I'm not allowed an ice cream. Oh, yes, you are. And you can imagine what the parents thought when they picked them up at the end of the week. They were not happy. But, you know, we now know, and we knew then probably, that we could free the diet up. But it was the doctors in charge. I choose the insulin dose. I'm the clever person. You stick to the diet. What a terrible, terrible thing that was done. So we've improved a little bit. Not much, I think. Yeah, another question here.
Yeah, it's different. Perhaps just a short question. You talked about Nova Rapid, which a lot of us are on, and it's not quick, it's really slow. And I've been on that for years, or 20 years probably. Is there any other insulin, or is there any research into a quicker insulin, apart from having to take it intramuscular?
Okay, so you might not have heard that, but it's a very good question. I mean, I used to do work with Novo. I probably won't get a job with them at all anymore because I was rude about Nova Rapid, and I don't mean to be. Novo have made some incredible discoveries on insulins, long-acting insulins, and it's not their fault that they can't make a quick-acting insulin. Even an analog isn't quick enough, and you know, and nearly make Humalog, but it doesn't sound as if it's quick, so that's why I didn't go for it. There is ultra rapid Novo insulin, but to be quite honest, it doesn't work as well as we would want. You'd still need to wait at least 20 minutes. So it's a bit better, and we haven't been using it in Sheffield. I think we probably should. But the most interesting one of all is something called Afrezza. I don't know if any of you have heard of Afrezza, but it's inhaled insulin. And about 15 years ago, we tried out inhaled insulin from a company called Mankind, and they still make it, but it's not available in the UK. And we published a paper to show that if you inhale your insulin, it's really quick, and you can reduce hypoglycemia. We published it in, I think, Diabetic Medicine. And I got real promise, and it got into sort of disrepute because there was a worry that insulin into the lungs isn't a good idea, and it's certainly not normal. And could it give you lung cancer? But the safety probably is all right. And I would love to do a trial of inhaled insulin because I think it would make it much easier to match insulin to food. So it's a really good question.
I think you get a lot of people wanting to do the trial.
Yes, yeah. So Brenda, how long do I go on for here?
Oh, sorry,
You're the
I did
chair.
check it, that's 47, but not 10 minutes.
Another 10 minutes. Oh,
Well, as
okay.
you like, but,
I hope I get my dinner when I go home, but anyway, okay.
just a question on that. It's to me, it's not so much how long it takes, because as you said, you can regularly have your insulin half an hour before. That's got its problems, but still.
Oh, I think it's terrible.
Well, I do that with breakfast.
Okay, well.
Not necessarily, and it does work.
Okay.
Somebody phones up and then you find it's an hour.
Okay.
Anyway,
I'll translate,
yeah.
Brenda, when we're finished.
sorry, the question I was going to ask is, have you got is there any insulin, not that particularly starts earlier, but that works over a shorter time? Because
Okay.
it seems to me that if your food takes 2 hours to digest and your insulin takes 4 hours, after your food has been matching it, it's going to drop.
I think you, in a new life, Brenda, you should become an insulin researcher, actually. It's a very good question. So the question that Brenda says, it's not that it takes too long, it goes on working. And the answer is, it does both. And actually, the other thing that people do, and again, they can use their CGM to see the mistake they make, and and I don't blame them at all, is that often they take corrective insulin and it doesn't lower their glucose after an hour, and they think, oh, I'm going to take some more. And the very worst hypo I've ever, not one of my patients, had on a pump. And of course, if you're on a pump, it's easy to take extra shots of insulin. And he took 5 shots of insulin to get his glucose down because he didn't work out his exercise. And he had, I mean, a terrible hypo. And that was all brought on by somebody not explaining. So never take lots of corrective insulin. Just grit your teeth. And to be honest, the high glucose or one-off ain't going to make that much difference anyway. So yeah, and we call it stacking. So if anybody tells you you're a stacker, that's a bad thing. Stacking insulin, because you're stacking up the insulin. Okay, we have somebody else who's got somebody called Claire. So if you'd like to unmute your microphone and ask your question, that would be great.
Hi
Okay.
there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question really about national guidelines versus local ones sometimes. So last week, I think a few that are on this call were also on the DSN forum network with Partha Carr, who was talking about CGM, and they showed us a table of what's coming onto the formulary so that it can be prescribed. One of those things being the Dexcom 1 that's coming on the 1st of August. So I've sent a preemptive email to ask in principle if it's the same cost as the Libra, which I'm led to believe that it is. Can I move from Libra onto the Dexcom 1? And the answer is that they're awaiting confirmation from the lead pharmacist as to whether the area prescribing committee have agreed that this goes on the formulary. So I just kind of don't understand really, if it goes on at national level, why does it then get blocked or potentially get blocked locally?
So it's a very good question, and I'll answer it as discreetly as I can. The problem is that health service costs are going up. I will be careful about the government, but to say that the NHS is not being properly funded, and of course, essentially you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, and costs will have to be paid. Do I think that people with diabetes should have every bit of tech which has been shown to be effective 100%? I do think that some people find the Dexcom, I don't know what the new Dexcom, which is a cheaper version, will be like. I think it'll be pretty good. I should also say that some people have tried the Dexcom and have gone back to the Libra, so it's not for everybody. And the new Libra, when it comes out, Libra 3, will automatically upload their glucose results. So it won't be needing to be scanned as it is at the moment. So that will be an advance. If it's the same price, I can't understand why they shouldn't. But I think it is about costs. For me, if you make yourself a bloody nuisance and demand it, and if you've got prepared to do it, usually to shut you up, they'll put you on it anyway, because most people won't bother. Do I think that's a good way of running a health service? Of course I don't. And I think everybody should do that. On the other hand, if you said to me, what is the most effective thing you can do for diabetes, you're not going to be surprised, type 1, to say everybody should do a structured education course. To give a life-saving but lethal medication to people without giving them the proper training is dangerous. In fact, if it was a drug, you'd probably get sued. And yet we allow insulin to be used in this country inexpertly. And although structured education, hopefully DAFNE, because it's evidence-based and most other courses are not, are offered to nearly 50% of type 1s, less than 10% actually attend a course. I think that's shameful. And
I've done it.
good. Of course you. Of course you have.
Yeah, and it is very worthwhile. But for me, I've got the Libra on my repeat, but it's no. I won't go into detail, but it's no good for me. And the Dex one is the same cost, and I just think, well,
I agree.
I've not filled my Libra prescription for a year. I've self-funded Dexcom G6 instead, but you know, times are hard.
I absolutely
paying for it.
I agree with you. But I think we need to give people the skills to manage their diabetes, and we need to give them the technology to manage it more effectively. Of course we do. And it is, I was going to say shameful, but look at the results in higher income countries. Even without that, very few people die. Type 1 diabetes is extraordinary. When I started training in the 80s, I hardly ever saw anybody above the age of 70. And now we have 80 and 90-year-olds in our clinic. I can't remember the last time anybody came into the clinic with a white stick, and actually an amputation. It is so much better, but it is still an incredibly demanding condition. And of course, we should give people the facilities to manage it as easily as they can. And perhaps that's time to stop. Unfortunately, we've got a chair who would like me to talk till 3 o'clock in the morning, I think.
Thank you.
Oh, now lastly, we need the raffle.
Yes.
Is that right? And we have got quite and you've got a great chance of winning this. As far as I can see, only about 25 people on the call.
So they need us to get some more raffle tickets.
But it's, we probably need to stop though, Brenda. So yes, hang on.
I think we probably need to do the raffle away from here, so that the people who bought tickets on Eventbrite, we can give them ticket numbers.
Okay.
But, oh yeah. Do you want to show them what the prizes are?
Oh yeah. So just let everybody know, we decided we're gonna, you'll have to just trust Lindsay. She's a very honest person, I think, and she will not choose the ticket for herself, I'm convinced. But what we're going to do is issue the numbers, and then the raffle will be drawn, but we'll just to entice you, show you the prizes, which are what?
Simon Bliss book, the Michael Bliss book.
You haven't got the book to show them there. The Michael Bliss, his discovery of insulin, that would be we've got Slow Down, Sugar Licks, I'm Diabetic, which is just
show the front page.
It's a nice picture, yes? And a notebook, sorry, to write all your glucose results in, which of course nobody does anymore, but that's okay. A bottle of vintage port, oh, that looks nice, 2007. And anything else? Oh gosh, everybody's going to win a prize. It's the best raffle I've ever heard of. Hand gel. Oh, well, don't know if I want that one, but still. It kills 99.99% of all bacteria, though. That's good.
You could work for no
And the last prize is this?
I don't know what it is.
Well, I know, yes, but it's your last prize.
Oh, it's the last one.
There's a cup of tea there, but I assume that's not the. And the last one is Cleaner Eleanor Bomer. It must be a perfume or something. Oh, it's a candle. It's a scented candle, sandalwood. And with that, I want to thank everybody for their attention. Brenda, do you want the last word?
I've just come to thank you, Simon, for a very
You better
interesting evening.
stand in front of the camera.
Just come to thank Simon and Helen for a very interesting evening and for answering our questions so patiently, particularly mine.
Pleasure. It's a pleasure. Okay. Bye, everybody. Thank you for putting up with me. I appreciate it.